Pakistan, a nation teetering on the brink, a land of vibrant culture and breathtaking landscapes, yet simultaneously a breeding ground for instability and regional conflict. From deep-seated economic woes to unchecked extremism, Pakistan's actions have cast a dark shadow across South Asia and beyond. For years, the narrative has been carefully crafted, but today, we pull back the curtain. In this video, we expose the harsh realities and the difficult truths about why Pakistan is a nation struggling with the self-inflicted wounds of its own making. We'll uncover 10 stark reasons why Pakistan is arguably a failing state. Let's start with the most fundamental issue, the economy. Pakistan's financial state is a disaster. For decades, the nation has relied on a toxic cocktail of corruption, mismanagement, and short-sighted planning. The country has become chronically dependent on IMF bailouts, each one more desperate than the last. But these aren't solutions. They're simply expensive bandages masking a deep wound. Instead of long-term investments and sustainable growth, resources are squandered on vanity projects and military ambitions. The result? Ordinary Pakistanis, the silent victims, bear the brunt of this economic catastrophe, facing rampant inflation, poverty, and a bleak future. Then there's the farcical nature of Pakistan's political system. The idea of democracy here is, frankly, a joke. The military has an iron grip, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. A revolving door of inept civilian governments are either puppets of the army or are simply overthrown when they don't play ball. Corruption is rampant. It's not an exception, it's how the system functions. Leaders are more concerned with lining their own pockets than delivering for their citizens. The result is a constant state of political turmoil and a complete lack of effective governance. Pakistan is notorious for its state-sponsored terrorism. It's not a secret. It's often a point of open discussion. Groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, responsible for countless atrocities, operate with impunity within Pakistan's borders. Even the discovery of Osama bin Laden hiding in Abbottabad exposed Pakistan's duplicity. These are not isolated incidents, but a deliberate policy of using terror as an instrument of regional influence. By funding and supporting terrorist organizations, Pakistan destabilizes its neighbors, particularly India and Afghanistan, and cements its reputation as a dangerous global liability. The state's promotion of radical Islamist ideology is another huge problem. Blasphemy laws, designed to protect religious sentiments, have been weaponized, used to settle personal vendettas. This creates an atmosphere of fear, where religious minorities live in constant danger and mob violence is common. Dissent is crushed, and free speech is impossible. Pakistan's dangerous flirtation with extremism has made it a breeding ground for intolerance and a threat to its own secular-minded citizens. This extremism leads to the horrific persecution of religious minorities. For Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and Ahmadis in Pakistan, everyday life is a struggle. Forced conversions, abductions, and systemic discrimination are commonplace. Particularly, women and girls from minority communities are disproportionately targeted. The government's failure, and some might say, its unwillingness to protect these citizens, is a disgusting stain on Pakistan and a horrifying human rights crisis. The religious intolerance in Pakistan does not just target non-Muslims, it festers within the Muslim community as well. Shia Muslims, Hazaras, and Ahmadiyya Muslims are frequently targeted by Sunni extremist groups. The government seems unable to rein in this violence, and in some cases, there's barely a whisper of condemnation from the state. This sectarian hatred tears at the very fabric of the nation. While Pakistan spends billions on its military and nuclear weapons program, the basic infrastructure crumbles. Chronic power shortages, inadequate healthcare systems, and neglected public services reveal the government's warped priorities. What's the point of having tanks and fighter jets if the majority of Pakistan's citizens don't have clean water or access to proper healthcare? This neglect isn't just incompetent, it's a deliberate choice to prioritize military might over the needs of its people. Pakistan's foreign policy is rooted in conflict. From supporting insurgencies in Kashmir to its questionable relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan, Pakistan's actions have earned it global condemnation. Rather than trying to be a force for peace, Pakistan seems to thrive on tension and confrontation, repeatedly choosing to be an agitator and a destabilizing influence in the region. Pakistan also has a complete disregard for its environment. Rampant deforestation, unchecked pollution, and water crises are exacerbated by a lack of planning and foresight. The result is repeated natural disasters, which wreak havoc each year. The government is not only failing its people today, but they are also destroying the future prospects of the country with their sheer neglect for the environment. The world is losing patience with Pakistan. Its support for terrorism, human rights abuses, and unwillingness to cooperate have left it increasingly isolated and distrusted. Calls for stronger sanctions are getting louder. Pakistan is no longer just a concern for its neighbors. It's now a global concern. The consequences of its actions are felt beyond Pakistan's borders, and the world is simply running out of ways to support a nation that has so openly and repeatedly sabotaged itself. The nation is facing a crisis of trust and has very few allies on the world stage. Pakistan's education system is in shambles, with millions of children deprived of their basic right to education. A lack of resources, outdated curriculum, and gender bias contribute to a bleak future for a significant portion of their youth. This failure to invest in education perpetuates poverty and limits Pakistan's potential for growth. A deeply ingrained practice in Pakistan is cousin marriage, a tradition that often leads to genetic disorders and health challenges for children. The risks of inherited conditions like thalassemia and congenital birth defects are significantly higher when close relatives marry. This practice perpetuates a cycle of vulnerability and suffering, often due to ignorance and social pressures. Pakistan's geography is a mess. It straddles a historically Indian landmass, but tries to differentiate itself by rejecting that heritage. This geographical and historical disconnect contributes to its identity crisis. It's a nation that feels it doesn't belong and constantly seeks validation through conflict and invented histories. Pakistan suffers from a deep-seated slave mentality. It constantly seeks to emulate other cultures, from Arab to Turkic and even Central Asian. This lack of a sense of its own identity has led to an identity crisis, where the nation does not know where it belongs and is always seeking validation from outside. Pakistan's national narrative is deeply flawed. It celebrates foreign invaders who wrought destruction and plunder on the subcontinent, while deliberately rejecting the heroes of the then undivided India. This selective and distorted historical narrative contributes to its insecurity and its perpetual state of conflict with its neighbors. Pakistan's problems are vast and complex. It's a nation drowning in self-made crises. The pain and suffering inflicted on its own people, along with its destructive regional policies, cannot be ignored. It's clear that radical change is needed, but it must come from within. The global community must also hold Pakistan to account for its actions. The people of Pakistan deserve a better future, one free from corruption, extremism, and conflict. And that future depends on profound and systemic changes.